Monday, the legislature met in special session. That morning early at 8 o'clock, there was a select group that had considered the congressional maps that were being brought out as a response to a lawsuit that had been filed. They voted on what they called Map C. They sent that to the general body, which was voted on in minutes. And I think that's the map that is now going before the judge.
That's right.
It took like an hour for the plaintiffs in that lawsuit to file their third amended lawsuit. So the case is not over yet. The plaintiffs in the lawsuit, who I guess you could say prevailed to the point where the judge ordered the legislature to revisit the maps.
Which they did under duress, but
right.
nonetheless
and
they
protest,
did it.
Right,
yes, they protested, but they brought forth several options, again, eventually choosing what they've come to call Map C. They had a short timeline, so therefore they had a short public comment period where we were allowed for about a week and a half to also issue our opinions. You have Scott Sandel in the Senate and Candace Perucci in the House that were leading those efforts, in which they said they individually went through all, I want to say there was about 4,500 comments. They went through them all, they said, and took those into consideration when they proffered Map C.
So we've got with us this morning Brian King, the Democratic Party chair, who luckily also happens to be a very skilled lawyer, to break down where we are here. Brian, thanks for joining us this morning.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm honored to be considered an inside source, guys.
There you
That's
go.
right.
You are in every way. So tell us where we sit with this, and did we get it right so far?
Yeah, well, you've outlined it well. I think it now goes back to Judge Gibson, Diana Gibson, who is the district court judge, for a final ruling from her as to whether she accepts Map C, which is what the legislature complainingly, but nevertheless presented to her as their choice to comply with her order from back in August, or whether she says this does not comply with what I have required and what Proposition 4 and the Supreme Court decision from last summer requires. And so I'm going to have one of the plaintiffs' maps so that I pick is more reflective of what needs to be put in place, or something else. I mean, she has some options of her own. She has a broad amount of discretion on this. So we're just waiting for that. I think there's going to be a hearing week after next, and hopefully we'll get a ruling quickly. The real challenge here is there's some strict time frames that have to be met. I think the lieutenant governor has said there has to be a final decision made that she can use as a basis to, start the process of making sure that what we have in place for 2026 in terms of maps is written up and distributed to the county clerks, yada, yada, yada. There's a lot of work that goes into that.
So, Brian, this is sort of a fascinating time from a political science perspective. Lots of roles at the table. I would love to know the party's perspective on where you can most impact the process. I mean, the Democrats elected to the House and Senate proffered what I'm going to call a Democratic choice in that process, which was not the one chosen. But also, as you suggest, you're the one that's going to be left with the results of who's on the ballot according to which jurisdictional map. So with your hat on as the Democratic Party chair, where are you looking to make the most impact from a party perspective?
Well, let me say this. Map C, the one that the legislature chose and forwarded to Judge Gibson, is an improvement over the maps that we had in 2024 based on the redistricting in 2021. So I'm happy, as the chair of the party, that we've got something that moves us more in the direction of fair representation than what is in place based on the maps that are currently sitting in Utah. So we're moving in the right direction. I view this as an opportunity for Utahns to have a fair shot at electing people that fairly represent their values and their priorities. We haven't had that in the past. We're moving closer to it with Map C. Whether Judge Gibson chooses Map C or not, I'm happy that we are seeing effort to, even under duress by the legislature, nevertheless, a recognition that they have to comply with the court order, and that we are seeing the people's will as Proposition 4 brought into place. And here's the thing, you ask what the opportunity is for us as Democrats. When you have more competitive seats, Mara, as you know, you get better candidates. You get candidates who are really highly qualified to step up and say, well, I wouldn't have considered running in a race that I was certain to lose, but this race in this particular district with those particular boundaries, I can have a shot at more reasonably. I think 2026 is going to be a wave election that favors Democrats. We're seeing a lot of things coming out of the White House and out of our state leadership that people really don't like, that are not addressing the problems that they have in their day-to-day lives. So it's an opportunity, is what it amounts to have really high-quality Democratic candidates step up, make their case to the people of Utah about why they should be elected, and hopefully we'll see some Democrats elected in these national offices.
Okay, so Brian, I'm going to take you up on being an inside source here. So one of the challenges with challenging an incumbent is always money. Do you have the funds to get your message out there? I saw a rare statement earlier this week from what I would call the DCCC, which is the Democratic Congressional Committee. I'm missing a C.
Missed a C.
Democratic Congressional something Committee.
Campaign Committee.
Campaign Committee,
Campaign
thanks.
Committee.
And they are who rank who the hot races are, who can get some national support. And I saw them put out a statement that was pretty sanguine about Utah. What's the early buzz you're hearing from the national Democrats about how interested they would be in funding a Democratic race in Utah?
I talked to Ken Martin about this, the chair of the DNC, just the other day, and I said, Chair Martin, I think we're going to have one seat that's competitive here with these new maps. And he said, 1 seat? Dude, you're going to have 2 seats. So there's no doubt they're focused on this. They're looking at it. There just aren't that many seats in the 435-member House of Representatives in Congress that are competitive. Gerrymandering and siloing of communications and messaging have really, caused us to be polarized into red and blue camps all across the country. And when you look at seats that are really swing and that can change hands, it's no more than 2 or 3 dozen seats in the entire country based on past performance. And so the DNC and the DCCC, these groups that in the past have not paid much attention to Utah, I don't think there's any question that if we get those new maps, if we get even Map C, which isn't the map that I think Map C is about as favorable to Republicans as anything that they considered. But even that map, I think, fairly puts into play at least a couple of seats to be competitive for Democrats.
Thanks, Brian. That was Brian King, Democratic Party Chair, who's always available to us. And there were so many things we needed to get to with him.
Right.
I think you and I can revisit those later, not the least of which is, well, where do we go? Are there some viable candidates out there? And are there more than one district that's available here? What's happening with redistricting? I think the Democrats have some reason for optimism. And, of course, once you have that, as Brian said, certain names come out and some people come out.
Oh, and Greg, Brian didn't have some reason for optimism. He suggested that he thinks 2 seats for Democrats out of our 4 total seats.
Yeah, well, possible. I mean, he's party chair.
That's his job.
Yeah, so then, of course, then you start thinking, well, who's a viable name? And you and he said something that hit close to home with me, which is like, well, if it's a real race, you get some viable people, as opposed to when I ran, which was like, me personally, we didn't have much of a chance, but I still felt like, I'm an attorney. I always feel like I have a chance of winning. Well,
and you ran for a statewide office.
Right.
That's huge in Utah. And one thing that brings up is, I think something when we think about candidates, something to keep in mind is, I believe we have a very different logic stream when we're thinking about electing a state candidate. That's governor, attorney generals, those things. Then we do who we're going to send into battle. I'm going to use that word intentionally. Battle at the federal level.
Right.
Like what kind of scrappy person do we want fighting our fights in federal government? Tends to be very different than the person we want as governor representing our state and having the conversation with us. So
good point.
This is for this would be who the Democrats are going to offer after a pretty contentious redrawing of some maps, who they would send into battle that Utah would send off to Washington, D.C. Now, recently, before the census, before the redrawing, we did have a Democratic representative, and that was Ben McAdams. And he would loosely have been in Burgess Owenson's seat. That's not quite one for one, but loosely.
That's who he lost to, right?
That's right.
So I guess his name would be near or at the top of the list of people who may be a viable candidate, and I don't know what his level of interest is, and that I don't know that it's important. But I would have to say this, Mara, he ran well.
Mm-hmm.
He did serve in Congress. He also served as our mayor of Salt Lake County with some distinction. I thought he did a very good job.
Well, and the reason that that's important is one of the things we always look at is who's running and who else has ever voted for them.
Right.
And when you're the Salt Lake County mayor, you're the second largest government in the state of Utah. And that means a lot of people have already voted yes to him. So we'll have that criteria as we go through this whole list of names. But having people who have voted for you in a prior election is a huge advantage to someone running.
And money's a big issue, too, and he raised over $5 million during his 2020
He sure
election
did.
bid.
And he got a lot of national money.
Okay, so let me run a couple of other names by you in no particular order. And let me just talk about our city and county mayors.
Yes.
And maybe group those two. And not that they're all the same, but they're both popular. They're both, Democrat, let's face it.
Yeah.
Erin Mendenhall,
Yeah.
it's a nonpartisan position, but she sort of leans more Democrat.
So Erin Mendenhall has had an enormously high profile. Salt Lake City mayors have high profiles.
Right.
They're different. The capital city's mayor is different than the others. She's represented us for the Olympic bid, so that gives her some neutrality about who was she representing. She's very talented in front of the media. I mean, one of the things you have to look at a candidate is how quickly they can connect and how well they do with the media and social media and modern channels. So she is well known for having a large communications team at the city and for putting a lot of emphasis on communications. That gives a potential candidate. Again, you and I are talking about names. We don't know how interested anyone is.
Right.
But I would put Mayor Mendenhall as a likely very strong candidate
Really?
to get out there because of her skill set in communications.
You put Mayor Wilson in that same category?
Mayor Wilson has run for federal office in the past.
She ran against Mitt Romney, I think.
Yeah, she did. She has shown interest in a number of races. She is, as we suggested with Ben McAdams, she's the current Salt Lake County mayor. So she had the majority of those of us living in Salt Lake County vote for her once. She's been a county council member for quite some time. She's been an elected official for quite some time. She's pretty seasoned at running the trap. So she would be someone who could put together the apparatus rather quickly.
Okay, and she's run twice. She ran recently for re-election and did very well in Salt Lake County against a strong opponent. Let me ask you about a couple of our representatives, Senator Nate Bluen and Senator Kathleen Reeby.
Two very different folks, right? Nate Bluen, I think of his own accord, would list himself as a firebrand.
Right.
He is often carrying pure pieces of Democratic legislation, ones that he knows may have not a likelihood of passing, but it's important to him that he's representing what he sees as a very intentional Democratic agenda. And he's younger, he's vigorous, he comes from the advocacy community. Kathleen Reeby has been a senator for a long time. She comes from the educational community. The question for her is, does that rally? Are people interested in having an educator in
And so
seat?
when Chris Stewart announced his resignation early, there was a special election, and she did run against Celeste Malloy for that position and ran well. I mean, there wasn't a lot of time for either of them, but so she's got some experience in the national political races.
That's right. We also have a few others who have also taken cuts before. We've got who we spoke with earlier, Brian King's in the mix. Brian King was a state representative, and he also ran for governor unsuccessfully this last time against
in the mix that, in terms
Cox.
of you and I thinking about the mix.
Yeah.
I mean, none of these people have said that they're jumping in necessarily.
That's right. Caroline Glick, who ran against John Curtis this last race, she's indicated from several people that she maybe isn't done thinking about her journey. And
she's very popular with the Democrats.
She didn't perform well. I will say neither Brian King nor she performed very well in that cycle. And one would have to look at that. Like there are folks who people like their race, but it's also really important to see how they did in the polls, how well they went outside of the Democratic base.
I would say this about those two, though. King against Cox and Caroline Glick against John Curtis. They ran against moderates.
Yeah.
And so I think in the general election that that hurt them both. You know what I mean? When
Yeah.
you say they didn't run well, they didn't run particularly well. And neither of them, I think, even won Salt Lake County,
Yeah.
which was
I mean, what
strange.
I would say is in this cycle, they're going to run against an incumbent. So,
Yeah.
so they're going to, so whoever the Democrats put up needs to have the mindset of running well against an incumbent if they're really looking at showing well and really gaining. One of the things, you and I were talking about that I think it's interesting is let's make the assessment that there's really only one of the seats that maybe significantly
Right.
changes the outcome
Right.
for a Democrat. It would still be worthwhile for the Democrats to field 4 great candidates. I mean, that would be
Exactly.
interesting. The other interesting thing to remember, so we've been spending all this time about boundaries. Where are the boundaries and what that would mean? Here's a fun fact about Utah. We have elected several members of Congress who don't live in the boundary that they're running for. I find that so curious.
Right.
We've largely not cared that much, starting with, I think the first one was Jason Chaffetz. Since then, I mean, Ben McAdams didn't live in his district. We have not. Now, to be clear, they didn't live 100 miles away.
Right.
They lived, I don't know, 2 miles away.
Right.
But nonetheless, we have not
It's not a
seemed
requirement.
particularly
Right.
concerned either that you don't technically live in the district that you're running for.
One last name, Luz Escamilla.
Luz Escamilla, she's run for Salt Lake mayor a couple of times. She also is a sitting state senator, has been. She represents the west side of Salt Lake City, and she is a long-term. She's interesting as a Democrat because she also has a really strong business agenda. That has been something that she's cared about a lot, is also bringing in a larger business and economic voice.
My guess is that we may hear a name that none of us are particularly familiar with. I mean, who knew Caroline Gleick before she ran?